20 years later, and I'm still unsure of what happened to Jeff. He lived 3 houses down from me during the first years of my life, and while I wanted nothing to do with him, I've been searching for him ever since. After that night 2 decades ago, he simply vanished from the face of the earth. No address, no phone number, no email, no Facebook, nothing. Rumor has it that after that night, Jeff's parents shipped him up to St. Martin's Psychiatric in Duluth. Rumor also has it that his corpse now resides in a cemetery on the outskirts of Lake Michigan. Either way, reality seems to have torched whatever was left of him, if there was anything left to begin with. And all of it, every event, every story, every rumor, is because of that sleepover. It just seemed so exotic on paper. Most of us lived in the same neighborhood, went to the same school, and attended the same daycare. We all knew each other, or at least knew each other's names. So prior to the Starbright Daycare summer sleepover, slumber parties were strictly reserved for one of a dozen houses, with no more than 2 or 3 kids at a time. But to have 20, maybe 30 kids together for one massive sleepover, away from our parents, was unheard of. It was insane, exciting, and most of all, adventurous. We all wanted, no, needed to be there. And with the event happening no less than 2 weeks before summer break, it only ingrained the hype of the upcoming months into our heads. Little did we know that the older kids, 3rd and 4th graders respectively, would be there too. But they were coming for completely different reasons. As a student at Cokato Elementary School, it's tradition to hear the tale of Michael Dodson at least once. Thankfully, it's usually reserved for the older kids. Usually. It's an ugly tale at that. Upon research, turns out to be completely true. The murder, the bail, the shooting, all of it. Michael Dodson, a former 2nd grader at Cokato, was indeed beaten to death by his teacher, Miss Blair, during an impromptu detention in 1983. Miss Blair was later released on $100,000 bail, only to be shot and killed by Mrs. Dodson after a primary court hearing. But the memory of Michael Dodson and his murder didn't die with him. Quite the opposite. Legend elevated him to the role of guardian angel over the kids at Cokato. If you were on the verge of snapping your neck on the jungle gym or facing a swift kick in the teeth, word had it that Michael would keep you safe from harm. The older kids told us 1st graders all of this because, according to them, Michael wandered the grounds of Cokato Elementary School at night. Maybe he'll pay us a visit, they told us. But the fun didn't stop there. In order for us 6 and 7-year-olds to truly appreciate the horror of child murder, we needed to be taught the Michael Dodson rhyme. For years, it spread by word of mouth within the student body, and on the night of the Starbright sleepover, it found its way to my ears. It's been seared into my mind ever since. He should have run. He should have tried. But Michael Dodson cried and died. He was always scared and he was always worried, so old Miss Blair wanted him buried. He caused a fuss each day in class. She wanted to cuss and stuff him with glass. She made a plan, for after the bell, when all the kids ran, she'd send him to hell. She took her rule, sharpened steel, turned brains to drool, and made him squeal. But he's still here. He hears us now. He's always here when you scream, ow. Yes, ow is meant to be screamed in your face. That's how the slumber party began. Thank God for structured activity, because without Red Rover or watercolor competitions, my 1st grade friend and I would have shit our pants. Every moment after hearing that story was measured by our shared unease, exchanged through glancing over our shoulders and standing guard when one of us used the bathroom. Because at any second, at the first sign of trouble, Michael Dodson's battered, dripping corpse would drag itself right next to us. I'm sure the older kids watched us, and I'm sure they were meant to be at their entertainment for the night, but their smile disappeared after a group game of telephone. Jeff Wright, the 2nd grader with a notoriously shitty attitude, was more than happy to sit next to me when the game began. I wasn't. I was second to last in the circle of 30 when 1st grader Sally Larkin seated at the very end. Mrs. Clark, the head of Starbright, began and delivered the message. It snaked around the circle, coiling in and out of everyone's ears. Jeff delivered his own version to me. Mrs. Clark has a lumpy ass. I hated Jeff enough already. And I hated him even more for baiting me into earning a red card on the discipline board. It wasn't worth the trouble of hitting him, so it sure wasn't worth inviting Michael into the mix. So I let it slide and reconfigured the message for Sally. I really wish I had a cat. The game was over, and we all leaned in with mounting excitement for the final answer, or how badly it was screwed up. But Sally didn't smile. She didn't speak, giggle, or even nod. She was simply there, frozen in place. Her lips twitched, struggling for words. "Sally?" Miss Clark asked. Are you alright? A gasp. A single gasp poured out of Sally's mouth. It hitched and it formed. He should have run. The room froze over. Every smile shattered. No one breathed and no one moved. "Michael." "Honey," Miss Clark said. "That's..." Sally twisted her gaze to Jeff. "You could run, but you shouldn't try no matter what, hun. You're going to die." The rhyme stumbled out. There were words. I heard something else. I was the only one to hear it. It turned to the back of the room. On the far side, a door cracked open, just a sliver. "You're a brat with a shit-eating grin. Give me a bat and I'll bash your teeth in." Sally began to sob. The door slid open more and something moved on the other side. Something sharp, something shining. "Here's the thing, Jeff. I'll be loud and clear. There will be nothing left of you, my dear." The door stopped. For a second, just a second, my eyes met with another pair. It was watching us. Sally screamed. She doubled over on the floor, holding back vomit. We all backed away, and Jeff's hand shook. Mrs. Clark grabbed Sally's shoulders. "Sally," she yelled, it's all right. But Sally didn't stop. She yelled and gagged. All eyes fell on her and Jeff. Something had spoken to Sally, delivering misery. Her body finally gave away, and she fell unconscious. Her parents came running after Miss Clark called. A few other kids left as well. I was too frightened to give an answer. So was Jeff. So were 20 other kids. Our silence granted us a spot on the floor because for whatever reason went through Mrs. Clark's brain, the star-bright summer sleepover was still on. Not that any of us could really process the situation. She tried her best to distract us. Pizza, movies, ice cream, the whole 9 yards. But we were silent. Static. Michael Dodson's ghost, or something far worse, had paid us all a visit. And it was surely coming back. When the lights finally went off for the night, my eyes were glued on the same door from the game. It would crawl out from there. I'd already seen it. I was sure of it. Positive of it. But my own fear exhausted me, eventually yanking me down into dreamless sleep. Miss Clark's screams woke me up. Everyone had already gathered around her when I stood up. It was Jeff. She was shaking him, crying his name, but there was no response. His skin was pale. His eyes were glazed over. Breath wheezed in and out of his lungs. She pulled up his sleeping bag. Bruised, bleeding, raw. Jeff's body was drenched in red and black. The paramedics came within minutes. Our parents followed soon behind, but I waited there, just long enough to witness the truth. As Jeff was lifted onto a stretcher, something tumbled out of his sleeping bag. It hit the floor with a metallic ring. A long steel yardstick. It was probably past midnight and everyone was sleeping. It was my very first sleepover, my very first time away from home. I wasn't used to sharing a room with others, much less 5 other kids. Bertha was snoring loudly and Maggie's nose was whistling. It was just impossible to sleep. I tried counting sheep, but that didn't help. I decided to get my phone out and play some games until I got tired. I didn't want to wake anyone with the light from my phone's display, so I got up to shut myself up in Maggie's closet. I was still playing when I heard the bedroom door open. I quickly locked my phone and listened hard. It was probably Maggie's mom. I hoped she didn't notice that I was missing. It would be very hard to explain why I was in the closet. I heard heavy breathing that really didn't sound like Maggie's mom or dad. I listened for what felt like 10 minutes, but it was probably just several seconds. I couldn't see anything except some dim light from under the closet door. Someone was just standing there in the room, breathing heavily. Something felt wrong. Something felt off. I was scared, so I stayed still and willed my heart to be quieter. I heard someone yell. Then the scream started. I heard loud thumping, thuds, banging. I heard my friends screaming and screaming. I jammed my hand into my mouth as the tears streamed down my face. I knew that something terrible was happening in that room. The sounds of skin and fabric tearing mingled with the smell of blood, and blood-curdling screams would haunt me for the next 15 years. The fear, my fear and theirs, paralyzed me. I sat there trembling and in shock until the sounds died away. I heard the footsteps leaving the room, and I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for the person to come back and find me. When the sound of silence became deafening, I picked up my phone and texted my mom. My text only had one word: help. I did not dare to make any calls or indeed any sound at all. Then I put my phone into silent mode, turned off the vibration, and waited. No one came. No text came. I waited still, too afraid to move. The hours passed as my legs turned numb. I was already out of my mind when I finally heard my mom's voice, followed by her screams. It was then that I had passed out. For the next 2 years after a nightmarish sleepover at Maggie's house, I shared my parents' bedroom. I dreamt of blood and gore every night. It was hell. We moved to a different city a month after that incident. I dropped out of school very quickly, and my parents had me homeschooled. I entered college at 19, got my degree at 22, and finally gained employment in a software company. I never moved out of my parents' house. It just didn't feel safe. They never caught the person who butchered the 4 9-year-old girls. Maggie's parents were reported missing and were never seen again. Now, 15 years of therapy later, I still can't go into dark places. My house is perpetually lit. I sleep with all the lights on. Yesterday, I received a letter that came with my office mail. It was a large, expensive-looking white envelope with gold borders. Inside, there were 3 pictures. The first one was the carnage that was in the bedroom all those years ago when I hid it in the closet. I threw up when I realized what I was looking at. The next one was the front of a cabin surrounded by lots of trees. The third, oh my God, she's alive. If that's called living, that is. I threw up again and again until my vomit turned green. The vile sight of her twisted limbs are still fresh in my mind as I type this. I've notified the police. Now I can only wait until the nightmare revisits me. He'll come for me. I know it. I'm sitting here, holding my gun and waiting for him to come. I will continue to wait until the day I die. He will never take me alive. The next day, a second set of photos showed up in my office. I quit my job with no notice and moved. Yes, I'm that paranoid. My parents, too, quit their jobs and moved with me. They are very disturbed that this has surfaced, and we are currently surviving on our savings until we can figure out the safest move to make. The police were given all the photos, and they know how to contact me. This sicko is contacting me for a reason which I do not yet know. Why now? Why send me the photos? I looked at one before I threw them back into the envelope that came with and called the police. The photo I looked at was of her, posed like a puppet. She was strung from the rafters with an arm bent backwards in an impossible angle. Her eyes, or should I say eye, as only one was actually there, was rolled back. She had no eyelids. The right socket was empty where an eye should have been. The only reason I could even recognize it was her was because Maggie has a small mole at the center of her forehead. We used to play in Maggie's house after school. We were invited over every other day, and our parents were more than happy to send us there. Maggie's mother would always go through our homework with us, and then it was snack time and then playtime. Playtime was almost always spent either watching cartoons or playing make-believe. We watched a lot of Sailor Moon cartoons. I was always so envious of Maggie's mole, as it was at the center of her forehead, just where Sailor Moon wears a red ruby. When we played make-believe, Maggie was always Sailor Moon. She had long blonde hair with the ruby mole. She was naturally the main character. I wanted to be her, but it was impossible. My mother wouldn't let me dye my black hair, and everyone agreed that I was to be Mars. I suppose that is better than playing Janice, She had a short bob and was always made to play Tuxedo Mask, the male character in the cartoon. The rest of them were Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter. Anyways, we would always wear our school uniforms, hum the song, and change into our characters. It sounds so stupid now, changing our clothes in the backyard and turning into sailor characters, but we had a lot of fun. Now, why am I telling you the make-believe sessions of Sailor Moon? Because that was what she was wearing in the photo. She was wearing an adult-sized Sailor Moon costume, all strung up like a broken doll. She was obviously wearing a cheap wig that was made to look like Sailor Moon, and there was even a wand in her right hand. I don't know why this person has done this horrible thing to Maggie, or why they chose Sailor Moon, or why they're sending me these photos. All I know is that Bertha, Lisa, Terry, and Janice died in the bedroom that day when I was supposed to have been killed as well. I'd always believed Maggie and her parents were dead and buried somewhere in the wilderness. It makes me sick to know that she's still alive. Kept barely alive in such a state for this many years, and now this person is after me. About 3 years ago, a few friends and I decided to have a sleepover and do those wonderful, immature, and fun things that 15-year-olds do. We ate copious amounts of junk food, watched horror movies, and frolicked like newly house-trained puppies. Even the topic of conversation turned into paranormal experiences had by select members of the group. I myself had never had such an experience, but I've always been open to the existence of ghosts. In fact, my friend Rebecca, who is very much into Wiccan magic, ESP, and the like, was the only one to have had brushes with the paranormal. In her room, something under her desk would bite her ankles. She would see dark shapes in the corners of her room, and once on webcam with her cousin, he says he saw a woman behind her. We were all completely enraptured, but I began to feel slightly uncomfortable. The temperature in the room felt like it was dropping, and the air felt close, like there was a pressure squeezing my lungs. The other 5 in the group quickly felt the same, and Rebecca said it'd probably be wiser to not talk about ghosts. And thus we attracted unwanted attention. To most of us that sounded pretty fair, but it wasn't the worst sleepover for no reason. Zane, a guy we were half friends with but not too sure of it yet, decided he was going to try to imagine Satan's image on the wall in a reversed pentagram or sigil of Baphomet and try to call something through. Rebecca, of course, flipped her shit at him, but he continued to stare blindly at the wall. He started rocking gently and mumbling under his breath. Possibly the worst part was that he didn't blink, and we stood there for a good 5 to 10 minutes trying to get him to quit it. The temperature dropped, and I started to feel the hairs on the back of my neck and on my arms rise, and I felt that same pressure, the closeness in the air that made it hard to breathe. Rebecca was panicking at this point, and it was becoming clear that something was definitely happening. My friend Kara grabbed a blanket and threw it over his head in an attempt to break eye contact, and we noped the fuck out of the house, down to the very end of the driveway. Kara stayed at the door for a while to see what was going on with Zane, while the rest of us huddled together in fear, cursing that SOB for not listening to us. Kara came over to the group, and we all gaped at her as she told us that he had started mumbling about burning something, and death, destruction, and general mayhem. At this point, we were all staring at each other saying, "Is this a joke, right? A really bad fucking joke, but right?" After a while, the only other guy in the group, Eric, finally worked up the courage to go back up and see what was going on. He got about 2/3 of the way when the door slammed open and Zane stumbled out. At this point, all thoughts was that a hoax fled from my mind. He walked towards us with a heavy limp, and he looked... I think the only way to explain it is to say that he looked old. Eric fled back down the driveway to us, Zane following at a rather impressive pace, limp and all. Rebecca turned and screamed at us to run. Looking back on it now, it's almost funny. I can't believe that I didn't question it. But at the time, all I could feel thrumming through me was the sensation of danger, complete terror. We booked it down the street, and Zane followed. It was past midnight, I think, and completely silent in the street. 2 faint glowing orbs at Kara's unit gate were the only lights we had. The 2 of us ran down the street, and at Rebecca's urging, crossed the other side, where we stopped to watch Zane's progress. He came parallel with us on the side of the street, and then paused as if confused. We slowly began creeping back to try and get around him and back into Kara's house. Just as we were almost home free, I looked back, just in time to see Zane's legs fold up underneath of him. He crumbled to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. I cried out, and Kara and I both made our way to go over to him, but Rebecca grabbed hold of us and pushed us back into the house. "Don't let him touch you," she hissed. "It'll leave you vulnerable to whatever has him." And against all my better judgment at that point, I left him unconscious in the street, and we locked ourselves into the house. About 10 to 15 minutes later, Kara had enough and was about to go look for him. She opened the door and hardly even stepped out when we saw him limping, shuffling his way up the driveway. You better believe we locked that damn door and backed the fuck away. He pressed his face against the screen, his eyes curiously half-lidded. There was something about his eyes that felt wrong, and it teases at my memory, although I can't place it. He kept asking over and over for us to open the door and let him in. Eventually, after we refused him enough times, he wandered away. When we all finally bucked up the courage to go find him, headed by our wonderful Wiccan Rebecca, he was just crouched outside the door, utterly silent, and his knees drawn up to his chin. Rebecca said that he was in between, and that she could see dark orbs over his head at the corner of her vision. She sat there with him for a while, until she could get him to move. With about 3 of us supporting his lax body, we managed to get Zane inside, and lying down on a mattress, he instantly fell asleep, and when he woke up in the morning, he had no memory of what had happened the night before. He complained of being tired and that he hurt all over. We all made the executive decision not to invite him to sleepovers anymore.